We'll call the meeting to order. Standing committee, on access to information, privacy, and ethics, meeting 135. Pursuant to Standing Order 1083H7, the study of privacy of digital government services. And today we have witnesses as individuals: Jeffrey Roy, Professor, School of Public Administration, Dalhousie University; David Eves, Lecturer in Public Policy, Digital HKS, Harvard Kennedy School; and last but not least, Amanda Clark, Assistant Professor at Carleton University. Now, before we get into it, I just wanted to say today, most of you have seen by now the release about the International Grand Committee. It was sent out at noon today. I spoke with Damien Collins, our UK chair, this morning as well, and it's gonna be a developing story as things roll out. We're gonna send out requests for groups to appear, and likewise we're going to be adding countries to the groups countries that we already have, so that'll be forthcoming. And if you want any further information, just feel free to ask. I have a question from Charlie, and then I also just wanted to speak just before I go to Charlie. Madame Fortier had submitted a witness, and I just wanted to say for the record, you can submit witnesses at any point. We had a deadline just because we needed an initial amount to get going. But if you have a witness that you think would benefit the committee, send it in to the clerk or my office, and we'll make sure it gets put on the list. That said, I do want to get the witness list to you, where we stand right now, so you know where your witness is in the queue. And Charlie Angus.
Well, I'll just 2 points on that. One is, I'd like us to look at a witness list. So far, we haven't done what normal was done on communities, to say how many meetings and then break down witnesses and decide whether we need them all. So I'd like to do that. But I just would like to put for attention, because we're going into a week break and I don't want to take any time from our wonderful astute witnesses, but given the Globe and Mail article on the allegations of SNC-Lavalin, given what's being posted about the lobbying that was done, it will fall to ethics to start to look at this, particularly the question of what kind of lobbying was being done by SNC-Lavalin. So I will be bringing a motion for discussion, because our committee will be expected to look at anything to do where there's allegations about improper lobbying that may have changed the direction of any kind of policy. So I'll be bringing that forward at our next meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. Any further comments? Okay, we'll get going. All the witnesses today, thank you again for appearing, and you have 10 minutes. We'll start with ladies first. Ms. Clark.
Thank you very much. My name is Amanda Clark, and I'm an assistant professor at Carleton University's School of Public Policy and Administration here in Ottawa, where I hold the Public Affairs Research Excellence Chair. I've been researching and advising governments on digital government for about the past 10 years. This work actually first began here. I used to be an analyst with the Library of Parliament, and I was sort of on the scene when parliamentarians first started asking us questions about things like Twitter, Facebook, and open data. So it's very interesting to be back here and speaking on some of these topics again. My work in this field continued with doctoral studies at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford, where I completed a PhD study comparing digital government reforms in Canada and the United Kingdom. The UK portions of that research looked quite a bit at the government as a platform model that the UK government has instituted. I know you've talked a little bit about that and the government digital service, so I'll be happy to speak to that in the questions. The Canadian portions of that research most recently have been published in a book laying out the history and trajectory of digital government in Canada, where I focus in particular on the tensions between some of the demands of digital government and our tradition of Westminster government in Canada. Last, I'm currently leading a research project on civic technologies and data governance. In particular, this work is unpacking the role that private actors play in digital government service delivery, and explores governance mechanisms that can be used to ensure more accountable and equitable stewardship of personal and public data. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak to the committee today, and I applaud you for putting what I think is a really important issue on the parliamentary agenda. With my remarks, I'm going to focus on three topics. The first is the tensions and complementarities between digital government services and privacy and security. Second, I want to look at data governance and the privatization of digital government services. And third, I'll talk very briefly about Indigenous data governance. So on the first theme, the committee's study really aims to promote effective digital government services while also protecting Canadians' privacy and the related issue of security. And I think you're right to identify these objectives as potentially being in competition and to try to seek a balance between those two priorities. So in discussing this balance, the committee and earlier witnesses have identified a number of ways in which it appears that federal public servants in particular are too lax in regards to the privacy imperative. So there's been discussion about lost hard drives containing user data, withholding information from the Privacy Commissioner regarding data breaches, for example. At the same time, in my research with federal civil servants, I regularly hear an
Yes. I just wanted to say our interpreters are having a hard time keeping up with you.
Cool.
So if
Okay.
you just slow it down a little bit.
Fair enough. I did
fine.
have
I
a
do the
coffee
same,
right
so
before I came here.
Thank you.
My students complain of the same thing. I'm sorry. Okay. All right. I'll take a breath. So at the same time, as I just said, it seems like the committee seems to be under. I mean, there was a lot of discussion about the federal civil service not having an appropriately robust appreciation for privacy. At the same time, in my research with federal civil servants, I regularly hear an alternative narrative. And that narrative presents public servants as, in some cases, overly zealous in their concerns over privacy and the related question of cybersecurity. Now, many of you might respond, how can governments be overly careful when it comes to privacy and security? Shouldn't that always be top of mind? But that view, if you buy into it, essentially allows those concerns to be a trump card in many instances, and in many instances that can directly undercut scope for much needed innovation and improvements to the services that the governments provide to Canadians. It can also really undermine the efficiency and effectiveness of the daily operations of the government, in particular when it comes to policy analysis. And oftentimes this overzealous concern for privacy and security doesn't even really address real privacy and security questions. So 3 concrete examples. Many government offices don't have Wi-Fi, in part because overly risk-averse managers have decided that the risk to security and privacy is simply too high. Many government officials similarly can't download tools they need to do their work, such as free software online that would allow them to do sophisticated data analysis, or even really simple data analysis. They're often banned from accessing websites with really pertinent information to their policy work, websites that are regularly used by stakeholders and by service users. Perhaps more significantly, in part due to privacy concerns, current legislation, vertical accountability regimes, and corporate information management strategies favor the siloing of data in the civil service. This approach really undermines the potential to produce important improvements, not only in service delivery, but to allow for policy analysts to work with data across many different policy areas. And that kind of cross-cutting policy analysis that draws on data from multiple departments is increasingly important as we acknowledge that the policy challenges of today don't sit nicely into departmental silos. They are inherently cross-cutting, and they don't respect departmental boundaries. So in these instances, civil servants, and this is a regular daily complaint, they really can't access the tools, data, and people they need to do their job well. This creates work environments that are kind of reinforcing the stereotype of government as being out of touch, not being innovative, which certainly does very little for the recruitment efforts of our current public service. More significantly, it ensures that we're going to continue to see substandard and failing government services that reinforce Canadians' already low levels of trust in the state. So to be clear, I'm not advocating that the government cast aside a concern for security and privacy. Rather, I'm suggesting that approach the committee should be advancing is one that accounts for the trade-offs and costs to efficiency and effectiveness that can come from overly prioritizing privacy and security without taking a more balanced approach. So here I'm advocating for permissive, flexible frameworks. And what would those look like in practice? Well, we can actually look to some current efforts already underway in the federal government that show there is some really promising efforts being taken by civil servants to strike the balance the committee is seeking. So just to name a few, the Government of Canada recently introduced a digital service standard, which prioritizes privacy and security, but provides means of upholding those principles while also developing services that meet users' needs. In addition, Canada has actually recently emerged as a global leader in developing very progressive frameworks on the responsible use of artificial intelligence in government. This work is attempting to balance, again, those imperatives of respecting principles of equity, democratic representation, transparency, privacy, and security, while also being very innovative in how we use data to improve government services and develop more robust policy solutions. Importantly, this work on responsible artificial intelligence was done in the open and developed with stakeholders and experts through a Google Doc, giving it a degree of legitimacy, but also adding an important level of transparency that I think we should be applauding. Last, I'd point to the Canadian Digital Service, housed in Treasury Board Secretariat, created in the 2017 budget. And this is another place where the government is recruiting a fleet of talent with a lot of technological expertise, but also bringing in some really sharp policy minds in order to balance the imperative of improving government services while also upholding principles of privacy and security. And here I mean top of class, sort of best industry standard privacy and security, things that I think really are pushing some great innovations in government. So I think we actually face a very promising landscape, and I think the takeaway for this committee should be that we need to keep reinforcing that work, and that demands funding to enable hires and to build up staffing in these areas. It also means giving some of these existing units leading this work the legislative, policy, and administrative levers they need to scale their work across the bureaucracy. Because while these are promising efforts, they really are just at the beginning, and they're largely housed in the center of government right now. Okay, so I only have a few minutes left, so I'll just move to the second point that I wanted to discuss, which is on data governance issues that arise in the privatization of digital government services. So what I really wanted to hit home here is that I think it's important for the committee to acknowledge that many digital government services are not actually delivered by the state directly or at all. And I think this was kind of the early hope of digital government, in fact, that governments would release their data and others would use them to innovate. That narrative has been nuanced quite a bit, and I think governments are a lot more realistic about that now. Nonetheless, there are many federal government services that we access through platforms that government doesn't own. So I would turn you to the example of the TurboTax software that since 2012, over 12 million Canadians have used to file their taxes. Or something like Can Immunize, an app developed in partnership with hospitals, but also partially funded and endorsed by a number of governments, which is a mobile application to keep track of vaccinations. There's also countless other digital interfaces that we use to access digital government services. Some are directly procured by government, others aren't but are endorsed by government, some are independently run. I think the important question here is to ask, where those digital interfaces not managed by government, so privately owned, become the only or the easiest way of accessing government services. What is the role of government, and how can government ensure that the data those interfaces collect are respecting privacy concerns, but also adhere to other principles of good data governance? So where governments are contracting private actors, let's say, to deliver digital services, governments, I think, need to be very aggressive in defining what data can be collected, how such data can be used and monetized, who would benefit from that monetization. We also need to be very realistic about citizens' capacity to give informed consent to some of these private services, and to understand that, in one recent New York Times editorial, actually, they counted that if the average person was to read all of the digital privacy policies that they agree to in a year, it would take 76 working days. I think our models of consent in thinking about some of these private services, we need to be a bit more thoughtful about that as well.
Thank you, Ms. Clark.
Which I really think we need to get on the agenda.
You're a minute over already.
Sure.
If you can do it in 10 seconds.
You've got it. It's just a quick last point, which I think needs to be, I haven't seen it yet in the discussions, but some of the discussions the committee's had haven't been made public yet, so maybe it has been on the agenda. But I would like to point the committee to specifically approach the issue of Indigenous data sovereignty in your work. I'm not an expert on this, but I can suggest others that you should speak to. There are very kind of unique concerns at play here and how the Government of Canada collects and uses data relating to Indigenous peoples, in particular how the services are delivered to those communities, and obviously giving ongoing ways in which that data have been used to marginalize and oppress Indigenous peoples. I think it's really incumbent upon this committee to particularly carve out some space for that issue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. Next up, Jeffrey Roy for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to read a brief opening statement in order to discipline myself to stay within our time limits today. Good afternoon, Chair, members of the committee, and esteemed colleagues. I wish to thank the committee for this opportunity today. I am pleased to participate in this discussion on such an important topic, namely how governments can both expand and improve digital service capacities while protecting the privacy and security of citizens and all stakeholders. I will begin by building upon a few of the comments made by the Privacy Commissioner in his thoughtful remarks to the committee last week. 3 points in particular stood out for me. First, the importance of the Government of Canada's data strategy roadmap. Secondly, notions of barriers versus safeguards. And thirdly, the Estonian model as a comparator for Canada and other countries. The data strategy roadmap is, in my view, an important reference point in this debate, as the Privacy Commissioner observed. It is a comprehensive discussion of both opportunities and challenges based upon the cumulative efforts of both Liberal and Conservative-led governments over the past decade, as well as like-minded efforts across all government levels and the private and nonprofit sectors. Data-driven capabilities are now widely regarded as critical enablers of service innovation in today's digital age. Such capabilities often imply and even necessitate data sharing across multiple government entities. Yet the roadmap aptly describes a fragmented public sector environment, often more vertical than horizontal, as Amanda noted, with a host of legislative and cultural barriers impeding a whole-of-government approach. From his vantage point, the Privacy Commissioner observes what is a legal barrier to some may be seen as a privacy safeguard by another. In my view, the essential task of this committee is to reconcile the inherent tensions embedded within this prescient observation with the shifting realities of today's society and the emerging opportunities presented by digitization. While I laud the critical efforts of the Privacy Commissioner to safeguard and enforce privacy rights on the one hand, it is also the case that many legislative, organizational, and political barriers do inhibit greater innovation through information and data sharing. Several pilot initiatives across the country, across all government levels, often encompassing more than one government level, have demonstrated how information and data can be shared without sacrificing privacy. Nonetheless, such pilots all too often flow against the currents of traditional public administration and proprietary notions of protection and control. In an era where openness and engagement are drivers of networked and agile governance models that challenge traditional hierarchies, privacy is bound to be a contested notion. While a large segment of society remains deeply concerned about privacy, others have simply written off the concept as dated and unrealistic. Bridging this widening cleavage requires trust in public and collective governance mechanisms, and key enablers of such trust are openness and dialogue stemming in large part from political institutions. In this regard, to my third point, Estonia is an enlightened example of a country embracing open source technologies and leading edge solutions for more integrated and online services. Central to that country's widely recognized success in this regard is the sustained and transpartisan political commitment to making digital transformation a societal project in the aftermath of the collapsed Soviet Union. A closer comparator to Canada in terms of political history and institutional structures, Australia too presents a compelling case study. Despite widely reported digital failures and privacy breaches, as all countries experience, Australia has steadily climbed to the upper echelon of the United Nations Global E-Government surveys over the past decade, inversely correlated to Canada's performance, partly due to a robust political dialogue and strong engagement on digital matters by elected officials from both the House and the Senate. Such political literacy helps to facilitate digital literacy across society at large. Australia has also recently created a new national agency with both federal and state level involvement devoted to e-health solutions and by extension reconciling privacy and sharing in that critical space. While I have great respect for the boundaries and benefits of federalism, an important lesson for Canada in healthcare reform is the need for greater intergovernmental collaboration in devising new digital frameworks for shared policies and more virtual forms of delivery. More broadly in this country, the absence of more robust collaboration, particularly with respect to financing and shared political accountability, is a major inhibitor of greater progress in digital service innovation. The plethora of public sector service centers in large and medium-sized cities merely underscores this point, further encouraging each government level to focus on its own service apparatus in largely separate manners. Canada is not alone in facing such struggles, of course. I'm presently engaged as a consultant to the OECD, assisting in a groundbreaking study examining digital government from subnational and interjurisdictional perspectives. An emerging theme from this project is the essential role of a holistic governance architecture for the public sector as a whole. I would offer two final observations. First, privacy in a digital era should not be framed solely or even predominantly as a matter of rights. Citizens, too, have responsibilities in becoming data activists, to quote CBC journalist Nora Young in her book entitled The Virtual Self. A new social contract for the digital era cannot be predicated upon unrealistic promises for unfettered privacy rights, especially in a world where governments must themselves challenge such rights for a host of reasons. Of course, the private sector also carries important responsibilities to customers and to all stakeholders. A more sophisticated dialogue is essential as a basis for public education and collective action. In my view as well, new forms of more direct public engagement in devising digital service solutions are also warranted. The final observation I would make is the essential role within the legislative branch for what I would call anticipatory capacities to better understand the challenges and the risks that lie ahead. The committee has undoubtedly heard experts discuss the potential of blockchain technologies, which some might associate with cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin. Beyond Estonia's widespread adoption of blockchain, Finland is deploying such technologies to deliver support services to refugees, while a separate Finnish pilot enjoins agriculture producers and local governments in a shared effort to improve employment services in rural communities. The European Union has funded several like-minded blockchain pilots, and it is notable here that the European Parliament has appointed a special advisor on blockchain to facilitate collective learning. In closing, I would commend this committee for your efforts, an important enabler of strengthened digital innovation in the delivery of public services, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you once again. We'll go up for our last witness today, Mr. Eves, for 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name is David Eves. I'm a lecturer here at Harvard University. I teach on technology and government, digital transformation at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. That said, I'm born and raised in Vancouver Quadra, so I know Mrs. Murray, who may be in attendance. I used to live in her riding until a few years ago. I also have been advising and thinking about transformation for about 15 years now. In fact, last appeared twice before the ETHI committee to talk about open data and my framework around open data and open information, open dialogue. I kind of turned into the policy framework that I think is still broadly used to organize transparency in government. Today I want to talk a little bit about digital transformation and its impact on privacy, and particularly I'm concerned with issues of governance and trust. One thing that the chair may, if he's so inclined, I just today published an article in Policy Options about lessons from Estonia that deal with some of the governance issues that I think are particularly pressing and questions that need to be asked. If it's of interest, it might be worth translating so that the committee can share to both its members. First, I just want to level set about what we're actually talking about when we're talking about Estonia and what it is that Estonia has done that makes it unique and worthy of talking about. And there's really three things I think the members need to take away about what Estonia has done. The first is that it has created a set of what we would call canonical databases where it stores information about its citizens. So this is like, where you live, what your driver's license number is. All of these things are being stored in databases, but they're being stored in a single database. So there's only one database for addresses, one for driver's licenses, one for something else, and one for something else. The second is the information in these various databases is linked together because every citizen has a unique identifying ID. So everybody has their own number. The number gets attached to that information in those various databases. So it's now easy to pull disparate information about a citizen all together to get a very clear view about who that person is, and then to offer that information to different parts of government as it's trying to do its service. This is a very, very different model than you would find in most countries, including Canada, where these databases tend to be what my colleagues refer to as siloed. The information is actually stored in several places. It doesn't get shared, so it's hard to get a full picture. It's hard to grab all the information you have about someone, and that's why you have to keep collecting it over and over and over again. Finally, the third big piece the Estonians have done is they've gathered information, they've connected it to individuals for unique IDs, and then they've made those databases, what I would call core infrastructure, available to anybody who works in government across all the government agencies, so they can then leverage it to build new services or improve the services that they already offer. Those three innovations, for me, are at the very core of what we're talking about. And if you don't understand those, then it's very hard to talk about the innovations or the costs or the dangers that are facing us if we want to go down that path. So I first just want to level set the committee around understanding those core issues. Why this matters, just speaking a little bit to my predecessor Amanda Clark's point, is that once you have this infrastructure in place, it's much, much easier to go and innovate and to build new services. The core promise that the Estonian government makes to its people is that it will, by law, it will only ever ask for a piece of information from you once. That means if it asks for your address, say the Canada Revenue asks for your address, it means if you go to the passport office, they'll already have your address on file and you won't have to give it to them again. The advantage of that is it means as you're building services as a government, you don't have to recollect and restore all of this information. You have it in a single place. And so you can leverage it when you build a new service by not having to ask for that information again, nor do you have to build all the infrastructure in that service to store and manage that information. For me, there's kind of three key questions I would really like the committee to be thinking about. The first is, as you're thinking about privacy information, I would love for you to be at least asking the question of what is the threat model that we're trying to protect ourselves against? There are predominantly two types of concerns people have about privacy, particularly in government. One is they're worried about an external actor attacking the system and gaining access to data that the government stores about people. This is typically a foreign power, and the fear is that they will then use that information to undermine the government or possibly even kind of collapse confidence in government institutions, and by causing people to not want to access information or not trust the government. The other kind of core threat model that I hope that a lot of time is actually spent thinking about is the internal threat model. I'm actually much, much more concerned about what my own government can do to me than I am concerned about what a foreign government might do to me. I'm significantly more concerned about what my own government can do to me than a private actor might be able to do to me. In this particular example, this can range from a government engaged in surveillance, but it can also be relatively mild activities, or what we're seeing, not mild, but narrow activities. So I'm particularly concerned about perhaps the ex-husbands of women using their access to government information to track where their former spouses are living and what they are doing. We certainly have there's ample history that happens in all sorts of places, particularly in police forces, but in other places as well. And even in small ways this happens that come onto our radar. People may remember that when Rob Ford went to the hospital, his records were illegally looked at by multiple people within the hospital record system. Relatively recently, 2 of those people were charged and fined. But that type of access, what you can do with someone's personal information, the way you can share it as an internal actor, in some ways concerns me more than what an external actor could do. So who are we worried about matters a lot here. The second piece is, while I am concerned about internal actors, this does not mean that I want to create so many burdens for them using these types of systems or gaining access to it. I very much want to echo Amanda's or Professor Clark's point about increasing security can be good, but if it comes at the cost of usability, then you create a system that's highly secure that no one can access or no one can use. I have students who work in the military here who talk to me about their laptops that take 45 minutes to boot for them to access because it has so much security on it. As a result, people don't tend to use their laptops. I'm not sure that we want a system that's so secure that nobody can end up using it. And then the third is the privacy is not actually absolute. We want some flexibility because I may not want you to be able to look at my healthcare records at any point, but if I'm dying in the street, as my colleague Jim Waldo says, I definitely want you to have access to my healthcare records, and I might not be in a place where I'm able to give you permission to do that. So we need a system that, while secure, provides some flexibility. My key recommendations on this particular piece is I think the Estonians did a lot of work before any technical work happened on their systems of really updating their privacy laws for the 21st century. And I think more importantly, creating systems of logs and audits so individual citizens could see who was accessing their data and they could pose questions about whether said access was legitimate or not and challenge authorities accordingly. The second thing that I'm particularly concerned about is if building this type of infrastructure might break the social contract that government has with its citizens. I think this may be humorous to hear, but most people are actually often quite comfortable giving information to their government because they believe their government does not have the capability to actually use that information to know very much about them. So they're willing to hand information over because they don't actually think government has the competency to weave information together to create a story about them. In the type of world that the Estonian government has created, this is simply not true anymore. The government's ability to pull information about someone together and to actually really understand the totality of that person's life is vastly increased. And Estonia has a very specific history and a very specific context that allowed that to happen. It's not clear to me that that exists in Canada. And so I would strongly encourage the committee to do outreach to the Canadian public to understand how much comfort is there in the public for them to have that type of experience. What do they want the government to know about them, and what would they want them to be able to do with it? And the particularly large challenge I think you will have is the citizen will tell you they want two things simultaneously. They will want you to treat them like Amazon does, which is that they will want you to recommend new services to them. They will want customized experiences. They will want to not have to re-enter their information over and over again. But don't you dare use my data to figure out that I've not been filling out my tax forms correctly, or that I actually owe money to the government for this other reason, and I don't want you to invade my life in ways that will make me unhappy. And it's not clear to me that you can have one without the other, or if you can, it's going to require a fair amount of rule thinking in order to get to that place. But I just don't think we've even begun to have the public conversation to engage them, to educate the public about how to get to that place and kind of rate what their comfort levels are about such a possible future. And then finally, I'm very, very concerned about who's going to end up building and, more importantly, controlling the infrastructure that Estonia has built. These database systems and the unique identifiers that come with them, at the end of the day, I wrote a case recently about a similar system in India, and I went in thinking there was a way to build this infrastructure to prevent a future political actor or a future actor from abusing this infrastructure. And the short answer is there's not. There is not going to be a technology solution to the types of problems of privacy that we're talking about. There may be technology that can help, but ultimately we're going to be relying on governance solutions. What is the governance that's going to protect the public from current actors and from future actors? And so for me, I think there's kind of probably three futures that I can imagine for us. One is we decide that building this infrastructure is simply too scary, that a government that knows this much is not one that we're comfortable with. There's a second model, which is we build it like the Estonians did, in which it's highly distributed, so different ministries own different parts of this core infrastructure. They're sharing their databases with other ministries. The dangerous piece about this is I actually think the governance in some ways is quite weak. Ministries may be unwilling to cut off other ministries' access to data if they're doing something inappropriate because they fear about retaliation, about that ministry cutting them off. And then finally, the other third option might be we build it in a way that's highly centralized, where there's maybe new governance models around a central institution. I'm almost done, sir. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, finish up.
Sorry, there's a nasty echo.
No, feel free to finish if you're just about done. I sense that you are, so.
Yeah, or we might build in a highly centralized way, but there I worry that a single actor would have control of over this type of infrastructure, and they could use that control to leverage control over other parts of governments, preventing them from launching services or forcing them to design services in certain ways that please them and not in the way that perhaps Parliament or perhaps that ministry would like to offer those services. And so my recommendation here is I think there's a lot of investigation around the governance models that needs to take place. And I'll pause there and answer more questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We'll start off for the first 7-minute round to Mr. Saini.
Good afternoon to everybody. Mr. Eves, I'll start with you first because you are living in the town where I also went to school. I went to Northeastern in Boston. So let's start with you. You've brought up the concept of platform government. So if we leave privacy aside for a moment, if we look at the core infrastructure, which I think it's an important way to recognize what is really involved. As you know, as a developed country, we don't have any green fields like Estonia does, right? Because they received their independence and they basically started from scratch. To some extent, India, depending on where you look at it, part of it was also greenfield also. But we are an advanced country. We have advanced systems that have been in place for 20, 30 years, a way of doing business, certain protocols. But in Canada, and when we look at Estonia, it's a unitary government, and it's only 1.3 million people. So in Canada, we have two issues. We have cross-department of sharing of information, and we also here, because of the system of our federalism, each level of government controls different pieces of information. So you have the X road in Estonia that goes across one level of government with separate databases, but here, in some cases where I'm from Waterloo Region, we have 4 levels of government: municipal, regional, provincial, and federal. So how do we, when you talk about this infrastructure, and if we use the Estonian model, which, in one way, all the information is not housed in one database, but spread across multiple databases, which would also incur a certain level of security. How do we do it in Canada when you have 4 different levels of government with 4 different core responsibilities?
All of the constraints that you have just mentioned. The Estonians did have a greenfield, which meant that they did not have existing infrastructure that was already, so it's much, much easier to build something from scratch than it is to try to kind of basically rebuild a plane while it's flying in the air. For me, I think there's two answers that I would probably say need to happen simultaneously in order for us to do this. I think actually the technical challenges of building this are going to be significantly smaller than the governance challenges. And so finding ways to get governments to agree on how to share information and how to share data is enormously difficult. So we better start getting the lawyers in the room together now, because it's going to take many, many, many years probably for them to get to a place where they feel comfortable. In fact, I was just chronicling this today in the healthcare.gov debacle of that website. The amount of data that you needed to have in order to sign up for healthcare in the United States had to come from 12 different agencies just within the federal government, and it took them, I think a year and a half just to negotiate agreements just for one service among stakeholders just within the federal government in order to share data so they could pump it into a single system to do one type of service delivery. So we better start thinking about that now. But I think my other piece of advice on that is if you start just doing that, it will never get done. You do need a forcing function. And so it might behoove us to find what is the critical service that we think would have the highest impact on Canadians that would be most helpful to make easy, and to start working today on that service and figuring out what data we need from various provincial stakeholders and local stakeholders and ministerial stakeholders of the federal government, and pull that in now to work on something very practical and very real. Don't get overly ambitious, focus on one, and then we would probably learn a lot about what we need to be doing.
Okay. My second question is to Professor Roy. We've heard from other people that data collected by the government should only be used for the reasons why it is collected. And the term, I think you've used this before, is data minimization. But when we look at the Estonian model, it's a one touch. And in that regard, in Canada, if you're going to have this system or you're going to advance digital government, it cannot be a continual repeat of information continually. Now, the way Estonia works is once you sign in, there's certain basic information that's housed, address, date of birth, social insurance number, whatever they call it there. But all that information is housed in one place, and from that place, it goes to different areas. But again, the concept in law in Estonia, which I believe, is that it's one touch. How do we do that here? How are we going to make sure that we can have the same effect? Because the purpose of digital government is to make things more efficient and easier. How do we put that in place here? Because, when we look at the complexity of the country, we look at the population is almost 20, 25 times more. It's an advanced country in other areas. How are we going to be able to have that concept? Because if you don't have that concept of one touch, then, the efficiency won't be there. And you won't get public buy-in, which is the other thing which I think all of you have spoken about.
Thank you for the question. I think it's one of the most interesting contradictions or paradoxes right now of government, this notion of privacy protection on the one hand and this idea of only using information for the reason that it's collected, which, let's be clear, that contradicts a lot of what governments are also promising to achieve with respect to more citizen-centric, more integrated service models. So there is that contradiction there. Certainly, David Eves could speak to Estonia much better than I can, but I guess prior to this committee, I was looking at some of the data governance work that's been done by the government of Australia over the past year. And they're currently preparing a new legislative framework to basically address your question. They put out a thought piece late last year talking about data sharing and reusability within the public sector and how that could work, and how to make that essentially work with a privacy framework that recognizes the need for limitations and transparency. I guess one point I would say, to be very concrete, is probably in the short term to medium term at least, there will need to be an opt-out clause for people to feel that they're not participating. I'll give you two examples of that. One in BC, several years ago, when they introduced the new integrated services card that brought together the driver's license and the healthcare cards, working with the privacy commissioner in that province, the decision was made to allow citizens that weren't comfortable with that integration to opt out. I believe a small minority chose to do so, and that continues to this day.
So,
With respect,
sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
I was just going to say quickly on the second example, with respect to digital health and the new health agency that's created now in Australia to create a health record for each and every citizen, there is there too very clearly an opt-out clause that allows individuals to basically, I don't know whether they do it themselves or whether they sign in and make the request, but to have their digital record withdrawn from and removed from the system. So I suspect that it will have to be a tiered approach where we create these new models, but that there will be some opt-out. And then finally, I would just go back to what I said earlier, the need for your committee's work, need to have a wider public conversation about what sort of level of comfort that citizens have in terms of data sharing, and also bringing citizens more into the conversation, having perhaps citizens advisory panels, citizens oversight committees to provide tangible input in terms of understanding what the trade-offs are and what the solutions are going forward.
Thank you. Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Kent.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you all for attending and informing us today. I'd like to start with Professor Clark, and you touched upon the necessary balance between the public and private sector in developing effective digital government, whether only at the federal level in Canada or at subsequent levels of government. And we have two examples. One, the failing Phoenix Pay system in Canada, where the procuring agency cut some of the complexities that the digital developer recommended to have an effective system in catching up with contracts, distributing pays, and so forth. And then the button was pushed too early on that incomplete system, and we have the disaster we see today. On the other hand, we have the City of Toronto Sidewalk Labs, where the city has pretty much given all control over to the Google sibling, Sidewalk Labs, and allowed them to develop in great secrecy, more secrecy than many Torontonians and digital authorities would like, to the point that Jim Balsillie, formerly of BlackBerry, basically said it's not a smart city, but a colonizing experience in surveillance capitalism. How do we find that balance? Does government have to better educate itself to be an informed buyer and an informed overseer of the way a digital government service would be developed and operated?
That's a great question, and I didn't have time to bring it up in my remarks, but I absolutely think if you're focusing on that question of digital service design and delivery, procurement is a huge, huge part of that conversation. I think there's kind of two interesting things happening on the procurement space right now. One is that I mentioned in my remarks that early on, I think a lot of digital government enthusiasts, in particular with the dawn of open data, thought that governments wouldn't actually have to produce a lot of their digital services. That model didn't pan out for a number of reasons, and one of the big ones was that there are a lot of core services that governments are going to have to continue to develop, both citizen-facing but also internal corporate systems such as pay systems, right, or email systems. So in response to that, one of the things we've seen is actually kind of an interesting return to the state on the procurement front, where we're seeing leading digital governments investing quite a lot in their internal capacity to be smart shoppers in this space. And actually, I would say that both Sidewalk Toronto and the example of Phoenix Pay System share part of the same problem, or originated in part from the same problem, in that in either case you didn't have, in the case of Toronto, the Waterfront Board, and in the case of the Government of Canada, I guess it would have been Public Works, having the sufficient expertise to make smart choices about what systems they needed. And this is part of what something like the Canadian Digital Service is attempting to remedy, to bring people in-house in government who can design contracts sensibly to actually procure what you need. The other interesting thing that I think is happening in this space is in how we had originally asked sort of what we need from a system. And this is moving away from designing, in particular, citizen-facing services around kind of government structures and internal government needs, and instead borrowing from a field of work called design thinking to instead really begin early on with deep research into users and how they're going to use a service, and then structuring any procurement you might need to do and any service design around that. Something like Phoenix could have been prevented in many ways by doing that kind of work early on and realizing the complexities of the system and what you would have needed. And that user testing allows you in particular to experiment at a small scale before you sign on to a long-term, what we call legacy contract, which often anticipates what you're going to need from a digital service before you've actually even tried it. And if you look historically, globally, at the big IT failures, it's these legacy contracts that didn't begin with small-scale user testing that lead to the big failures we see. Healthcare.gov was mentioned, for example.
Professor, thank you very much. That was very helpful. Professor Roy?
Is interesting. I'm a little... Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. The Sidewalk Labs example is interesting. I'm a little more hopeful on that front, that perhaps with more transparency and open negotiation, that a framework will emerge that kind of balances the public and private interests. So I do think that these sorts of examples are going to be very important to learn from going forward. I guess the one additional point I would make beyond Amanda Clark's comments is that there needs to be a mechanism in place to sort of facilitate the sort of public dialogue that we're talking about. I know right now the government of Australia is appointing and creating the position of a new chief data commissioner. I can't speak to it in too much detail, so I won't pretend to be an expert there. The UK government, of course, has a chief data officer. And I just think that, you know, as important as the privacy commissioner is, and I'm not suggesting a diminishment of his role in any way, there does need to be a way of thinking about data as an open asset as well, and engaging with the public and stakeholders about what the appropriate trade-offs are moving forward. And I think the idea of having a position, whether it's in the executive branch or whether it might be potentially a new independent position that could reach out to the citizens more, could, you know, be one way of sort of facilitating the sort of public dialogue that I think we're all in agreement is required going forward.
Okay, Professor Eves?
Yeah, just maybe two comments. The first I would say is, one of the things I think makes this topic particularly challenging is I want to make sure that we understand that we're in this room, I think, talking about moving from systems that are what we call kind of vertically integrated, where you're dealing with a system that maybe just does passports, to a system where we're actually thinking about something that's combined levels of horizontal systems that enable you to then quickly deliver new services on the top. So the passport delivery reaches in and grabs information from various horizontally layered services. And so I think one of the things the reason I appreciate your question, Mr. Kent, is that I'm much more concerned about the governance when you have these horizontal layers, because if you get the governance wrong on something that's vertically integrated, it's very costly, as Professor Clark's point, but it can be remedied over some medium or long-term piece, and it doesn't impact all the other things that are going on in government. But if we get the governance wrong for one of these horizontal layers, it's actually quite scary, because now everybody who builds on top of them is impacted by that. So it's absolutely imperative that this committee think very deeply about the privacy implications, the security implications, the design implications of this approach, because it has knock-on effects for what happens to everybody else. And I think that it's very likely that some of these horizontal layers will be held and owned by the private sector. It is unlikely, for example, in the long term, that I think the Canadian government will build and maintain its own cloud. It will probably have a private sector actor who's doing that. And one of the things that becomes then potentially challenging is that private player, they're determining what investments to make and how to expand that infrastructure, what future capabilities it's going to have. And those choices will constrain what the government of Canada can do. And those choices may even be done in a way that constrain us from choosing competitors in things that get built further downfield. So we better be really sophisticated and nuanced in understanding how these players are acting, because they may choose to constrain us in ways that are not immediately apparent to us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kent. Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Angus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I have my government phone here, and I get messages all the time telling me I have to do this function right away, and I try and do the function, and then it says I'm not allowed to do it because it won't recognize my phone. So that's all interesting, but that's not what our committee's here to discuss. We are the Privacy, Ethics, and Accountability Committee. We're not government operations. So there's a lot of cool things we could do. There's a lot of really neat things we could do. We could try and say how we're doing better government services, and if we believe that we can turn it all around, I think that's great. But our committee's job is to protect citizen rights. End of story. So I'm a little concerned, and Mr. Eves, maybe I heard it wrong. Were you quoting Nora Young when you talked about citizens having to be data activists and governments having to challenge privacy rights? What was that quote?
I don't think that was me, sir.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Roy. Sorry, Mr. Roy. Yeah, sorry.
So the quote itself was limited to the data activist part. It wasn't suggesting that citizens need to challenge governments. Just to be
Did you
clear on
have
that.
something about governments need to challenge that?
Pointing out that sometimes governments do need to restrict privacy rights for a variety of reasons, or think about limits to privacy rights, whether it's for service improvement, service integration on the one hand in terms of information sharing, or for a whole host of security reasons where information is shared, for a variety of reasons in terms of trying to focus on public safety and things of that sort. So I wasn't suggesting that governments don't respect privacy rights. I'm just suggesting that privacy is one consideration that governments need to balance with other considerations as well. And that Nora Young's point was more that citizens need to have a certain sense of responsibility for their own data ownership and be thinking about what transpires with their data and doing their best to try to understand that.
Thank you. Mr. Eves, I was very interested in you saying you were more concerned about what your own government will do with your information. Because we get told all the time, people only get information for good reasons, Police only go to get information from telecoms because it's important, but they do it time and time again without a warrant, which undermines the basic principles of the judiciary. We have, in Canada, time and time again, issues of private information that's been gathered. So how do we secure the rights of citizens from, maybe it's the security state, maybe it's people who think there's somebody, maybe a terrorist, someone maybe think they're just problematic, that they have that capacity to access all that data without any protections. Are you concerned about limits and how we protect citizen rights?
Yeah, I mean, this is why my second kind of grand point was about us breaking the social contract. And that, I think some people don't trust the state, so don't want to share information at all. Others think the state is simply not capable, so they're happy to hand over data because they don't think the state's actually capable of weaving that data together to do anything interesting with it. And other people are actually quite comfortable. They're like, I don't mind, I kind of trust the government. And I think the model that we're talking about with the Estonians is just so radically different from what we have today that we need to have a very intentional dialogue about what the new social contract might look like. In Estonia, one of the things that they did that I think is an important piece of that social contract is they have logging of who's accessing information about, say, Mr. Angus, and you can log in at any point. You can see who are the people who took a look at my data, and then you can then complain. You say, this person, why is this police officer, why is this doctor looking? And in Estonia, they're talking to their chief information officer. He said, yeah, in the early days, we prosecuted some people very aggressively who were looking at data they didn't have in order to reset the culture inside government about what was appropriate behavior. So I think my sense is that type of activity is probably going to happen with us. but it's going to need to be balanced with the police forces who are going to want access maybe with a legitimate warrant.
No, for sure. If anything with warrant, but also with government, we've had CRA people who spied on people's financial information. So if there's a protection mechanism so we can actually see that something's been looked at. So, and maybe sometimes it legally is, and if it's legal to look at it, then it's useful, but we need to know that. I'm concerned, though, what you said about the building and the infrastructure that's going to be, you know, is it going to be public? Is it going to be private? Because we have the issue, you know, with Sidewalk Labs, with Google. I mean, Google was kicked off Apple's apps because they couldn't be trusted because they were spying on people, and yet we're going to let them do the infrastructure of a major urban city. How do we say if we're going to have public spaces that they're going to be, how do we trust Google? I don't trust them.
One metaphor.
Sorry, Amanda Clark asked if she could answer that. Sorry.
I mean, I think you're right to bring up the Sidewalk Toronto example as something we wouldn't want to emulate, but perhaps maybe that's just where that begins and ends. I mean, I think the one thing we can learn from that disaster is exactly how this committee and other policymakers shouldn't structure the involvement of private actors in digital service delivery or in digital projects, right? And I agree with Mr. Eves that there will invariably be private actors involved in the infrastructure that our governments are going to be reliant upon to protect privacy, but also to, you know, design and deliver services and manage data. So I think the real question becomes, how can we structure those contracts in a way that allows us to prevent some of the problems that I think Mr. Eves rightfully put on the table, but
I just have a minute left, so I'm going to have to interrupt you there.
Yeah, of course, go ahead.
On Indigenous data. I worked for a First Nation, and government always said, just give us your data. We love you people. We want to work with you. Give us your trap lines. Give us your sacred sites, and we'll help map them. The only power the community had was their data, because Indian Affairs controls everything else, and the communities are not going to turn over their data. How do you think we can have a conversation about the rights of Indigenous sovereignty, given the 250 years of bad faith in Canada, and what data it means to an Indigenous community and to protect it? Because I think it's very important that you raised it.
Yeah, I think those are all key questions. I mean, as I said, this isn't my area of expertise. There's some really interesting work that Open North has led, working with First Nation communities in BC. There's also some really progressive work in this space from New Zealand, and I really think that bringing some Indigenous voices to the table here would be important, because as you note exactly, data is power. Data is power that these communities have, and traditionally, Canada has not used data in ways that lifted up Indigenous communities, to put it softly. Quite frankly, I think we can find very good examples of data being used to marginalize and oppress. It's part of a violent colonial history. So it's a really important piece of this discussion that needs to take place here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Erskine-Smith.
Thanks very much. I want to start with something really simple. Okay, so I have a social insurance number. I'm not entirely sure what it's for most of the time. Now I'm going to attach a password to that social insurance number, and then the government's going to issue me an RSA key with a rotating number to ensure that there's a two-factor system to it. Now I can access CRA immediately. Now when my wife was on mat leave and needed to access EI, she could use that same system. When I'm reapplying for my passport, I could use that same system. Why is that so hard, I guess, Mr. Eves?
It's a question of what are the implications of making that choice. So so we could say, okay, your social security number is now your unique identifier. So let's start putting your unique identifier against every piece of information that the government collects about you, maybe at the federal level, but maybe also at the provincial level and the local level. Now you could start to do things where someone could come along and say, well, let me see if I can query a whole range of databases and start pulling together information I know is very specific about you, and use that to create a profile of you that may be helpful, but I may choose to do things that are not helpful with that.
Great. Well, that's really useful. So now let's add another layer, and now there's a population register with my basic information, name, address, phone number, email address, perhaps. Hopefully the government is able to communicate with me by email in the way that I used to be able to communicate with my clients. It's bizarre that I can't get my blood results by email when I could certainly deliver legal advice, which is as sensitive oftentimes by email. But okay, so now there's a population register with my basic information, and now the only information that every department, except for that population register, has about me is my SIN. And so now there's an additional layer where if they don't know anything about me except for a connection of my information. So if it's a healthcare system, they know my blood results in relation to a SIN, but not in relation to my name. And if I want to access, if they have to access that, then they're accessing the population register first. And so now we add that layer. And then we add an additional layer, which is the Privacy Act, or the whatever the data governance piece that we want to layer on this, so to govern the queries that these databases can make of one another. Those are the moving parts to this system, and if we get those layers right, then the system presumably can function effectively.
So I think the system, so I agree. So I get very torn. I love this subject because this is the future I teach about. And I said, this is like the end game that we want to drive towards. Everything I'm trying to talk to you about today is the questions I ask myself of what happens if we win? What happens if we succeed? What happens if we get to that world? What are the things we want to be thinking about to mitigate the negative possible outcomes? And I would put forward that probably people like you and I have not experienced the worst violence that the state can bring upon an individual. And so if you are someone from whom the state has not always been a friendly and helpful person, you might be deeply concerned about what I would call a very hyper-powered state and its ability to use this information against you.
Yeah, so I appreciate that, and you laid out in your article 4 concerns. So if I go through them, and your first concern is the social contract. So say, as a starting point when we're rolling this out, if we were to roll such a thing out, say it begins voluntarily. So someone like me, someone like you, who has trust to at least try out this system can do so, and those who are concerned don't have to. Would that not meet the social contract concern, at least in the first instance?
It may in the first instance, but there's two concerns I would have as follow-on to that. So the first is the people who are most likely in need of state assistance tend to be those who are most likely to be marginalized. So I can actually imagine a kind of a two-track system where those who are wealthy, who actually really don't need to engage with the state very much, end up contributing very little information into the state, and the state knows less about them, while those who are most in need or those who are most marginalized actually end up putting a lot of information in the state, and therefore we almost have a state that's capable of large amounts of surveillance on the people who are maybe the least prepared to protect themselves.
But I don't know, I guess, why digital government adds this additional. So if it was opt-in, and there is the system as it is for those who don't have trust in the system, these data challenges already exist for governments. I mean, the challenge that you just laid out already exists for governments, that governments do share information as between agencies. There are pathways for doing so within the Privacy Act, within the Security of Canada Information Now Disclosure Act. But what changes because now it's digital?
Oh, a lot changes. The scale at which you can do things. Like right now, things may be digital, but my ability to share information between ministries and identify like who exactly is David Eves and to figure out which file is about that David Eves versus possibly another David Eves, that requires like someone's kind of a motivated actor who's piecing that story together. Whereas in a world in which everything's connected to a unique identifier, where I can go and identify exactly who I am and all of the information connected to me, and then I can do that at scale. I can do that for all 33 million Canadians simultaneously. Maybe I could throw a machine learning algorithm against that, and I could figure out what services I offer people and figure out who's Muslim and who's Christian. I could be doing all of that in a way that I could never do in the world in which we exist right now. And so I'm deeply in favor of going to this world, but I really want to make sure we figure out the governance models before we do it.
That's right. And I guess the question then is, we already have a governance model in place. It's been told to us multiple times that it is insufficient as it relates to the Privacy Act, but that would be the governance model that we're looking at. Is it so insufficient as of today? It currently governs data sharing as between institutions already. So just by virtue of the fact that I'm now allowing these agencies to interact, let's just say the population register is a starting point. It doesn't seem that worrisome to me, given these agencies all have this information, and it will allow me to access these services in an easier way. As a starting point, say we didn't even update the Privacy Act, although I think we should make recommendations on that front again, I don't really understand how the governance challenge is different, because we already have a data governance framework in place, the Privacy Act.
So my fear is that the Privacy Act actually is impeding certain types of activities that we would want to have and innovation that we would want to have, and not necessarily preventing certain types of activities that we wouldn't want to have. So that's why I worry about the current state of the Privacy Act. I don't think it's far from perfect, but I think it probably needs a little bit of reworking. And then I think more importantly, are we setting expectations among the public about what they want? Even an opt-in world, like, in India, they did an opt-in. In theory, their unique identifier was opt-in as well, but the alternatives become so poorly done that really, if you don't opt in, the service level is so terrible that everybody ends up opting in. And are you really opting in because you're happy to give this information over to the government and you actually believe that they're going to use it in good faith? Or is the hassle level simply so high that you don't really feel like you have a choice anymore? So I would really want to make sure I answer that question carefully.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. One thing I would just challenge Ms. Clark, if you see a point to inject your opinion, feel free to do so, unless it's up to the members to decide which to include in their question, who answers that question. But if you see a gap, just feel free to.
That's right, yeah. So I just wanted
Except time is up for you now. So we'll go to Mr. Gord next for 5 minutes, and then maybe you'll have a shot. So go ahead.
Oui, ça me fait plaisir, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for Ms. Clark. Right now, the digital services do exist in Canada in each department. Do we need to redefine digital services for Canadians? And do we need to safeguard what we have, or are we throwing the baby out with the bathwater? Who's going to benefit? Is it more the government of Canada that's going to be able to provide more services, and this interconnection between various departments, that's beneficial? But do Canadians want departments to talk to each other? Or have they even asked for it? I don't have anybody in my riding who's saying, I would like the Department of Revenues talk to the Department of Immigration. No one's never asked me for that. I think that Canadians need a redefinition of this. We're talking about a lot of data. It's going to it's going to take us a long time to do this, and we'll never see the end of the tunnel. So who will benefit from a redefinition of this digital government? Thank you.
Question, and I think it's come up a number of times, the question of sort of what do citizens even want in this space, and I think that right now we don't actually have very strong data on that question. So to speak directly to your point, do people want this? I mean, there's sort of two things. On the one hand, sometimes people don't know what they want until they're not even aware how good things could be, right? So your constituents might not be asking for this, but if they were shown how easy it could be to apply for a service and see their information already populated, or see how the organization of services around what we call life events could make their access to the state, interactions with the state much more seamless, they might be much more supportive of the kinds of transformations that we're talking about in data governance. So, I think, so what do I mean by organized around life events? This is something that the government of Canada has actually led on for quite a while. I mean, it might have come up in your discussions that we used to be the kind of darling of e-government. And that was because of early work that we did actually following the same principles that Estonia follows right now, which was to say that when citizens interact with the state, they don't care which department does what. They're not very interested in navigating a whole bunch of siloed websites. They're going because they just had a baby and they need to figure out all the things that they have to do when that happens. They also don't care about levels of government and often don't understand who's responsible for what, which can create a lot of inefficiencies in our interactions with the state. So I think very much the model of horizontal platform government begins from an appreciation for user needs. That's the driving force behind this when you look at the jurisdictions that have really led on it. And I think that's the kind of end game that we could be going for, to make it on a kind of just purely time and resource-based question, like when you go to transact with the state, it's fast, it's quick. But I think at a bigger level, this has democratic implications, because when I interact with the state and it doesn't work well, I question where my taxes are going. I wonder what is going on in all of those bureaucracies. It fuels narratives of the gravy train. It allows governments to say they're going to show up and clean up all the inefficiencies. I mean, those narratives rest in many cases on people's very personal stories of bad transactions with the state. I mean, the number of times I've heard Canadians say to me, oh, Phoenix is such a disaster. If they can't even run a pay system, how can we trust them to solve climate change, administer a carbon tax, handle child welfare benefits, run school systems? I mean, the list goes on, and I think we have to be really thoughtful about the kind of the larger stakes at play here. I guess on that point, I take Mr. Angus's point that there's some blurring of jurisdiction and mandate here between what you're focused on, which is privacy and ethics, and what other committees would look at around government operations. I think this reflects exactly what we're talking about, which is that policy issues are porous. There are problematic silos between parliamentary committees in many ways, and the decisions that you make and the recommendations that you put forth on privacy will have deep implications for how well we can structure government services, how well governments can operate. And I think the end game that unites the work of, say, the Government Operations Committee and your committee is delivering government services that citizens have faith in and that underpin a strong trust in the state. So, yeah, I definitely think that even if people aren't asking for this, this could do a lot to make your constituents happy.
It's time, so next up for 5 minutes, it's going to be split between Ms. Vandenbelt and Mr. Picard.
Thank you, and I'll be quick. My question is to Dr. Clark. And first of all, it's nice to see this kind of expertise right here in Ottawa at Carleton University. But I'm a little bit alarmed as an MP who represents a lot of public servants about what you've said about whether public servants may not be able to download the tools or the websites or even access Wi-Fi. So I just wanted to get a little bit of commentary on that, on how widespread that is. But the other question I have really is, well, you did your studies on the UK, and you mentioned something in the beginning about Westminster democracies. Does the form of government, so in our case Westminster style, does that actually have implications for how we can actually do digital democracy?
Yeah, so on the question about Westminster, I'd say one of the clearest potential tensions is around our vertical accountability structures and this horizontal model that we're increasingly pushing towards when we think about platform government or the Estonian model. Right now, the way that we allocate praise and blame in our system is through the notion of ministerial responsibility. When a service fails, when there's, when funds are spent irresponsibly, the minister is the one who's called to account. And in a really practical sense, they field those questions in the House, right? So who will be responsible, very practically speaking, in a concrete way, before Parliament when there is a failure in one of these horizontal systems? Now, I want to be clear. There are ways to overcome this, and the Westminster system, its beauty is that it is inherently evolutionary. It is built to adapt to the times. And I think we could explore what's often called models of horizontal accountability or shared accountability. And essentially it means, I think it's the point that we've been discussing, that this is not so much a technical question as it really is a governance question. Laying out ahead of time which parts of the bureaucracy and then which ministers ultimately will be responsible for how these systems are rolled out. I fear that right now a lot of the enthusiasm around platform governance has actually kind of ignored that question, in part because we're often just dealing with pilots to kind of show how this might work, but if we're going to scale this, we need to be thinking about those questions. I think the second piece of work that might be done around here is not just on the question of ministerial responsibility, but also getting into some of the data governance questions, which, I mean, earlier on, the point was raised, is the Privacy Act fit for purpose? The Privacy Act is one of the tools we need to look at to address these data governance issues, but it's actually not the only one, and it doesn't address a lot of the questions that we're talking about. I know Mr. Erskine-Smith mentioned the point about, well, how could this data be used and combined to, say, tailor services to me in particular, to say, hey, by the way, we know you had a baby, now you're eligible for this tax credit. Those kinds of questions, they have privacy implications, but they also have other questions around how data can be combined when we feel comfortable with the state contacting us directly, how we want different ministries to be able to access data. And privacy is one lens, but there's a whole other lens around ensuring we don't disadvantage certain groups over others and those sorts of questions. So again, it's the kind of the bleeding nature of the issues you're looking at. It's privacy, but we also need to maybe develop entirely new regimes, not necessarily in legislation, but kind of principles of data use. And again, that's why I pointed you to the work that's being done on artificial intelligence, because there, I think, is a great example of the federal government being really progressive and open in talking about some of the very real ethical questions that are going to arise when we apply artificial intelligence to policymaking. The same thing can be done for a lot of the questions you're talking about.
Thank you. I've been hearing about this Estonian model for weeks and weeks. Who worked on this model? Who tested it? And on which basis do you support your probably overrated appreciation of the model? Anyone?
Well, David, you wrote the article, so I'd say it's you who's got to field this one.
Maybe as a brief history of the Estonian, sorry, there's a really bad echo when I'm talking, so I'm not sure if
There's not echo here.
people. So one of the things that about the Estonian model is it emerged after the Soviets had left Estonia. They really had very, very few services, very few business processes in place, almost no infrastructure in place, and they really need to actually build a state from scratch. And I think the Estonians were lucky in that they started to do this right at the very same time that the web was emerging. And so rather than trying to simply replicate the way state services had been built in other types of governments, they looked at how people were building software on the web, distributed systems, with canonical data sets. And so they started to simply say, we're going to do something really different. They're actually forced by the fact that they had very little money. So they said, we can't afford to replicate all of these systems in every single ministry. So you had a very specific point in time with a very specific history with a relatively young leader who was willing to kind of give political cover to people to try to do something very different. And so that's kind of the historical roots of how Estonia ended up doing what they did. And one of the reasons why I actually think that they're a wonderful model to look at, but they're probably not a wonderful model to try to emulate because their situations were so unique.
Thank you, Mr. Picard. Next up for 5 minutes, Mr. Kent.
Mr. Eves, thank you for that. And I'd like to pick up on your question about threat models. Earlier this week, you may have noticed if you looked at at Hansard, at our Blues, Chris Vickery was on talking about the Estonian model and Estonia's claims on their website. I quoted their reassurance that they had been hacked once. They'd been subjected to a massive attempt by Russia in 2007 to penetrate their system. And Mr. Vickery was so confident that their system was hackable. There was a discussion here off camera sort of saying, well, why don't we ask him to try and do it in real time as we watch from Ottawa? What are your thoughts about threat models constantly evolving? Perhaps, as you said, the domestic threat is a greater real one in terms of individual privacy, but we know that the governments of Russia, China, primarily are constantly working to get into government systems, and whatever new system is developed, it's almost obvious. Mr. Vickery was quite convincing that someone will come up with a way of penetrating.
Yeah, I mean. For me, there's not really a big choice here. The foreign actors are already very interested in our systems, and there's a long history of them penetrating our systems already. I believe kind of like 5, 6, 7 years ago, Treasury Board was very, very compromised to a degree where I think they had to throw out almost all of the computers in the entire department. So it's not like, I want to be really clear, it's not like the current system is somehow secure and we want to move to a new system that has kind of, that is unsecure. I think what we have to be thinking about is, what are the types of threats and what do they mean for us? Under our current model, one of the maybe advantages is because it's disorganized for us, it's also disorganized for an attacker. So if they penetrate a system, they may only penetrate a single system and learn so much, but a system where, say, it's very easy to identify my unique identity and the systems are more connected, they may too now be able to penetrate a system and get kind of a more global view. And so that poses a new type of threat. The flip side of that is it may also be easier to defend, Right now, your information is only as well protected as the weakest database it happens to be in. And if it's in 5 different databases, it's the weakest one. So in America, that turns out to be, Equifax or some other core databases that get widely used. So it may be that some consolidation would actually allow us to bring our defensive resources and concentrate them. But there are real risks here either way.
Okay. Professor Roy, your thoughts?
To me, I think the key issue here is one of resilience and openness. When you go back to the Estonian model, which I appreciate everybody is, getting a little bit fatigued about hearing about, when they started using e-voting in that country, they put out their source code as open source and challenged people to find shortcomings in it. And a group of researchers found shortcomings and published it online. But that did not shake the confidence of Estonians to continue to use e-voting. It simply led to corrections. And if you think about Apple in the past week, notwithstanding their justified criticisms of Facebook and Google, as Mr. Angus rightly referred to, they too had a privacy breach with respect to FaceTime that they had to apologize for. So I think governments traditionally, especially with respect to IT architectures, have tended to be very inward in terms of thinking about proprietary systems, proprietary controls, and wanting to, of course, minimize the notion of breaches and the information that gets out around breaches, whereas I think we need to kind of turn that around and think more and more about being outward and open about just about admitting the vulnerabilities and looking more at how we can address them collectively and adapt in ways that improve the resilience of our systems in a both technical and social way going forward.
Professor Clark, we have time for.
I think that's a really excellent point that I'll echo. I mean, I think one of the kind of conditions that needs to be in place for all of this to work is citizen trust in the system. And that's also going to be about generating a certain tolerance for failure amongst the public. I'm not talking about, the public kind of smiling and shrugging off large-scale data breaches or anything like that. But one of the things that I constantly hear when I speak to governments that are doing very innovative things on digital is that part of that is that they have a license to innovate. They have a population that trusts the state has their best interests at heart. And that that their state will be open and honest about mistakes when they happen, and will has appropriate systems in place to manage those errors so that they're not large scale. I don't think we have that culture right now in the government of Canada. One of the previous witnesses, I believe, was Mr. Fishenden, suggested that one way we could improve the culture of privacy and accountability around privacy would be to institute a new extra-governmental oversight body. I would strongly disagree with that because we have a history in the federal government in particular of looking at all accountability issues as one where we need to create more oversight, more rules, more top-down kind of punishments. And what this creates in the civil service is this absolute fear that in trying anything new and different, if it doesn't go right, they're going to be smacked down so hard that A, you should lie about it when it happens, and B, you just shouldn't even try it in the first place. And it's incredibly frustrating for employees who are trying to do things that are different, but it also, I think, just puts a full stop on a lot of the innovations that we're talking about here, which will in many cases rest on work from within the civil service. There'll be parliamentary leadership, and we will need to have sort of ministers behind it, but civil servants are going to do the grunt work if we're planning on moving towards any of these sorts of models. So I think we talk about I think a model that focuses on accountability for learning could be a really important part of generating a culture in the Government of Canada that respects privacy, but that also allows us to be more innovative in our services. So yeah, I think that's something we need.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. Last up, Mr. Sikant for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Guess I'll start by thanking Ms. Clark for the work she did in the Library of Parliament. I co-chair Billy, and we're still talking about digitization. So thank you for that. I think I'm just going to go through what my thoughts were after I've heard everybody and then open it up for any comment. Initially, I thought, wow, holy 1984, and then the social contract that we have. I started thinking about how if we do something like Estonia and we can only ask for data once, okay, the data's there once, but governments change and the implications of that. And if you take that further, if there's a natural disaster and perhaps literally the servers are taken out, does that mean the government has now just gone down? And then there's the legal implication of that if you have to ask again for your information, as in Estonia they can't do that. Then I started thinking about foreign attacks. Again, if the Trojan horse comes, takes out the information, and we have to continuously give our data, the privacy implications of that. And then I started thinking about Amazon and how they do host their own servers and have algorithms. So the topic of whether it's going to be public or the government should have their own cloud-based data, Internet of Things is progressing. So is this something that we start to put resources behind under infrastructure? And then again, thinking, okay, if it goes private, we have elections and governments change, and then you can start to track people, as was pointed out. So I guess just along all of these thoughts, my question comes, if you do a cost-benefit analysis, do we need to go digital? Chime in and have any thoughts.
I guess I would just, can you hear me okay? If I could begin perhaps by just responding and saying that to go back to the issue of cloud providers and Amazon, I believe the government of Ontario has already outsourced a number of its database servers under the prior government to Amazon Web Services. And I think from a privacy and security point of view, it's setting the bar much too high for the public sector to be building the databases of the future. It's very clear that Shared Services Canada has struggled. That's no secret. And a lot of problems have arisen from that. Somebody referred to, a member referred to Phoenix a short time ago. There are, of course, imperfections and challenges in working with private actors, as has been discussed. But it seems to me that the better route is to work with the most sophisticated technology companies in the world that have the security capacities to enshrine privacy, as Apple tries to do, perhaps more so than social media companies today. And certainly Amazon and Microsoft are very focused on security in terms of their cloud offerings, but also engaging the private sector in a dialogue about the privacy implications of that and ensuring that there's robust accountability for how they, of course, partake in public infrastructure and what the implications are. I don't really see an alternative.
Just to follow up on that, so if the best technology was actually a different country, now our sovereignty becomes a bit of an issue. Do you have anything to say to that?
Of course, quickly, and that's why, despite this notion of a cloud that is very porous and server farms all over the world, many countries have negotiated agreements where certain data centers for certain types of data need to be located within national boundaries. That really shouldn't be a limitation for Canada, which has a number of data farms from large entities that have set up here, quite often very much under the radar screen because they don't want the locations overly publicized. But I do think that's not necessarily a limitation. Although I was just reading through, for example, my privacy license for this hearing, my privacy policy, excuse me, for President's Choice Optimum Online program. And they very clearly state in their program that they can't guarantee that data is not shared on servers in other countries as well. So it is a challenge. I grant you that. I'm not saying it's not. But I do think there are ways in which governments have stipulated. For example, even Apple has to store iCloud data in China, according to Chinese law. Most countries are going in that direction. So there's some flexibility between having certain data sets located only within the country under certain regulations, but having other data sets that are perhaps less sensitive, less critical in different layers of the cloud. But once again, still demanding that these private actors are transparent in different forums in terms of explaining how that data is being used.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Picard, for 2 minutes.
A
You have
very,
last question
very
before we
short
close?
one, yes.
Yeah.
Hi, people, that's me again. What is the threshold of the privacy aspect of my data? Who chooses what is private and the limit of what can be gathered? I'll give you a scenario in a smart city hypothesis. I don't want, if I walk in the street at 2 o'clock in the morning, I hate the idea that the government will have my facial recognition, know that I was there at this specific hour with someone I might or might not have to be with, and I do need my own privacy and let me alone. but I become a victim of a hit and run, I do want all the camera to get the son of a gun who got me and the license plate and the picture of the driver and everything. I wouldn't care that much about privacy. What's my challenge? Who decides what is and what is not private?
I tried to surface this earlier, and I said that I think that you guys need to be engaged in a dialogue with the public, because I had the exact same example with my healthcare records. I don't want someone to see them on any given day, but if I'm lying in the street dying, I definitely want people to have access to them. And there's the honest truth is there are not simple answers to these questions. And I think one of the things I know myself, I think Professor Clark and are trying to convey to you is, one of the key things we need to be thinking about is what is the culture and what is the norm that we want to build in this country around how we are going to manage these things. Because the opportunity space for us to do something different is there, but if the public doesn't come along and we don't move, then there's going to be an efficiency tax and opportunity tax that we all pay as Canadians that other countries won't be paying as they do things differently. So how are we not just going to build this infrastructure, but how are we going to bring the public along and build something that they have trust and they have confidence in, that they see as infrastructure they can rely on, not just from a technical perspective, but from a trust and privacy perspective. And I'm sorry I don't have a better answer for you.
On that, you're exactly right to note that people sort of want it all. On this point, I think the committee should be really careful in how it interprets a lot of the data we currently have on citizens' preferences with regards to government data collection and use, because most of these surveys don't actually present the realistic trade-offs to citizens. So you'll find countless surveys which suggest Canadians are very uncomfortable with certain types of data being collected and used in certain ways, combined with other data sets. The line around, would you want government to collect data and use it for purposes other than which it was originally collected? Of course, people reply no when it's presented like that. We need to move to surveys and studies which instead say data used for purposes other than which it was collected if it meant wait times were shorter at hospitals, if it meant you could be made aware of all the tax benefits you're not claiming right now and it would save you thousands of dollars a year. We have to put forward that value proposition, because right now most of our data only asks citizens if essentially they want to be surveilled and have their data abused. Everyone's going to say no to that. That's not what we're talking about here. This is really important trade-offs in the efficiency of government and the quality of the services they provide, with questions around data use, some of which are privacy related, but many more get into questions around kind of broader governance issues. So that's something that I think be careful in how you're interpreting some of those data, because they're just actually not very helpful. They would suggest to you that we should not move forward with many of the reforms that we're putting on the table, because they essentially say citizens only care about privacy. And I'm not sure that those surveys accurately capture the real trade-off.
Sure. Okay, Ms. Murray's asked for one question, so go ahead.
Oh, no, what I wanted to do is just to thank all the panelists and to say to David, yes, I've been here at this committee meeting. Thank you for your work, and see you in Vancouver Quadra before too long.
Okay. Thank you. I just have one last thing, bit of committee business. SUP estimates were tabled this morning, so I just wanted to ask if it was the will of the room to have the minister appear in the future. Yeah, I've already talked to Mike here, and there's an availability of March 19th or 21st. So March 19th or 21, is there a preference? That's when there's a gap there. There's an opening there, or two openings. Leave it up.
It's common practice.
Okay, okay.
I don't care.
Okay, so we'll proceed on that. So with that, I just want to thank all the witnesses for coming today, and appreciate your testimony at our committee. Thank you. Thank you. We're adjourned.